Hi, my name's Julian. I'm just going to give a quick little presentation on implicit self in Imba and instance variables in Imba. So we're going to start by going through a simple example class on Imba 1.5.2, and then we're going to look at the same example in Imba 2. And then if we have time at the end, we're going to quickly look at the same example based on the proposed changes from the most recent Imba meetup. And lastly, I would like to just show you what would be my best case scenario for this class. So just to walk you through the setup of the example here, I have a class. It is a wheel. It has wheel-like properties such as radius and diameter. I instantiate the class, and I have a bunch of console logs where I'm trying to grab data out of the class. And we're going to see, based on how we set up that data, what the result of those console logs is. So when I instantiate the class, I do it with wheel.new, makes a new wheel. I'm passing in this argument 5, and I'm passing it to this initialize function in the wheel class. This is Imba, so we don't have to have brackets around the arguments in the method definition or when we're actually calling it. I personally like to have the brackets. I think it is cleaner and just a little more obvious what's going on, but it is personal preference, and I believe the official Imba style is to not have the brackets, so don't feel pressured to have them just because I put them there. So we pass in that 5. It is the radius argument. So here where we set the at radius to radius, it's going to be set to 5. At radius is a instance variable as denoted by the at symbol. So that means that that variable is accessible anywhere inside our instance of the wheel. So when we set that instance variable, we can access anywhere within the wheel the radius instance variable, but we still can't access it outside of the instance. So when we do this wheel.radius, that wouldn't work if that was all we had. So if I comment this little helper method there out, we're going to get a type error because it's not a function. And that's because in Imba, all variables are private. The class does not communicate with other classes via variables. It only can communicate via methods. And so this at radius variable is private. And when we try to access it to print out the radius, it's not going to work. So what we have to do is we have to define this getter method that is going to return the instance variable radius. Of course, Imba, it's implicit return. So this, if I could type right, that is exactly the same as this. So we're setting a method called radius, and that is what we're accessing when we do wheel.radius. So that works fine. It's pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Hopefully that's not giving anyone trouble because it's only downhill from there. So if we look at the next variable here, the next instance variable is diameter, and we're just going to set that to radius times 2. Very straightforward. But you notice here, we nowhere in our class definition have that diameter getter. So, but it works. It gives us the diameter. It is radius times 2. And that's because we define the prop up here. The prop is very similar, if you're familiar with Ruby, to the attr accessor. So it defines both a getter and a setter for you and allows you to just really easily in one line get that all set up. So now I have my diameter and I can access it from outside. I can even set values from outside of the instance, which is really cool. And so that is not a super complex case. So if we look now at circumference, this one's a little more interesting because circumference, the instance variable, is set by calculate circumference. It's set to calculate circumference. And calculate circumference is a method. And what it does is it has the circumference factor of 2 times 3, which is 6, and we multiply the radius by that. And when we run our code, we see we get the circumference is 30, which is in fact 5 times 2 times 3. So that seems to be working well. So what's interesting here is this is a great example of the implicit self at work, because this method here is exactly the same as that method there. So we add the self, and it does the same thing because it was already doing that behind the scenes. So I can run this and it works. And once again, these brackets are totally optional. And so that means we have 4 perfectly valid variations that we can say, calculate the circumference and like give me that value. So that's really cool. I think this is the most Imba way to present that statement. I would prefer to have those brackets there so it's very, very clear that I am passing a method. I want a method to run. I do not want a local variable to be evaluated. And like it's really obvious here that this is a method. I can see it, but like as your code grows and your project grows and maybe your method grows, then it becomes harder and harder to make those distinctions just off the top of your head. And that's why I like those empty parentheses. So the circumference also has the getter so that we can get it. And yeah, that is how it works. You'll notice though, I've defined the circumference factor in a couple other places, right? So I have it up here in the where we just define our class. I also have it in the initializer. And I have it here as well. And what is really interesting is it does use this local one, but I'm not sure if it's using it because it's local or because it's the last one defined before it is used. Because if I get rid of that var there and run it, it still works. It doesn't complain that it doesn't know what this is. So that is a little bit interesting and definitely something I would like to investigate further. This next one is really, really cool. So color is set to red here. And this is not an instance variable. I didn't mark it as an instance variable. I did, however, give it a prop. So when it initializes, right, we initialize here, and then we log a bunch of stuff. And when I say, hey, tell me what the color is, it tells me the color is red. And so even though I didn't mark this with the @ symbol, it says the color is red. And in fact, if I do have color with the instance variable color up here, sorry, there we go, it's still gonna tell me it's red. And that is really cool. It's unexpected behavior from someone coming from Ruby. I think that that is gonna cause some confusion down the line for people working with Imba 1. If I move this down below, it will say it's blue. So it really is just whichever is run last is going to be evaluated. So that is quite interesting. And also, you'll notice I log the color, and then I run this paint green method, which sets the color, a local variable color, to green. Or so I would think. But it actually is setting the instance variable color to green. Just a fun fact, once again, this is the same as that. So it is going to return green, just a little aside. But it's also setting the instance variable color to green, which I would not have expected looking at this code. So yeah, make of that what you will. Hopefully now you will anticipate it in the future when you're working with Imba 1.52. So the last variable I want to look at, I think this case is even cooler than the color case, is this name variable. It's printed out right at the bottom there. There it is, the name is circle. And I defined this way up here when I'm defining my class. So it's I can just pass in a variable here, and that's accessible from this getter here for name. Of course, once again, it is a variable. It is private. If I do not have that getter, I cannot access it. Variables are always private in Imba. Classes talk to each other through methods. Sorry to kind of be a broken record on that, but it is a really, really powerful pattern, and I really would like to see people taking advantage of it more when they're making their Imba projects. So in this case, I have the variable name that I've defined, and I have my getter method that's called name. And then all it does is execute on this statement name. So what's interesting here is there is an ambiguity when like the wheel class, right? Because this is actually the same as self.name, right? That'll run. Oh, it's not the same as self.name. That is interesting. So name gives me circle, but self.name gives me an error, a maximum stack size exceeded. And that's the same error that I get if I comment this out, right? Maximum stack size exceeded. And so the reason I'm getting that is because this is the implicit self, and it's saying, hey, find the function on this instance that is name. And so it finds itself, and it calls itself, and it finds itself, and it calls itself, and it just keeps doing that until I get this error. But when I have this variable name here, then when it's trying to resolve this, it says, oh, I know what this is. This is that variable name that's present on the class. So in a way, I've set up a class variable here outside of the initialize method. I think this is a very bad pattern. I don't think people should be doing this. I think it is very, very interesting that in Imba 1, they can do this. Once again, if I get rid of this, I will get that recursion. If I add self here, I get that recursion. Just for a fun experiment, we're going to just quickly put this down here, and I get that recursion. So it's very brittle. That behavior is, I think it's difficult to predict. Maybe that all made perfect intuitive sense to you. If so, Imba 1.52 is the Imba version for you. So that's everything I wanted to talk about in Imba 1. I'm going to quickly go to another tab here where I've got the very same thing all set up in Imba 2. So I got my Imba 2 file here. The date today is like March 19th. So it's the Imba 2 version that was pushed to Scrimba on March 19th. I don't know exactly what version that is. I don't have visibility into that very easily. So here's the same thing. You'll notice there's one change. The initialize method is now called constructor. That is a superficial change. It literally doesn't matter. It's just a different word. I think it was done, though, because JavaScript uses constructor, whereas Ruby uses initialize. I am always, always sad when I see Imba moving more towards JavaScript, which is kind of like what it is meant to supersede, and away from Ruby, which is probably my all-time favorite programming language besides Imba, of course. So yeah, it's a superficial change, though. It doesn't matter. There are some changes here that are much more significant. So when I run this code, it's not going to run. We get this error, unexpected prop. I found an easy way to get rid of this. We just delete all our props. Boom, there we go. So that error is gone. And now I'm going to get another error, unexpected var. So apparently, I can't just randomly be defining variables when I'm defining my class. I think that is a good move. So that is a change I am 100% on board with. I call that an upgrade between Imba 1 and Imba 2. Hopefully, none of you are too upset with that. So here we go. Circumference factor is not defined, of course, because now I'm no longer defining it there before we get into the constructor. So I have to define those here. Perfect. And so there we go, everything ran. You'll notice some differences though. So the radius behaved pretty much exactly the same. That's good. So I think that's pretty good. When we get to diameter, there's something a little bit interesting to note. So one thing to note is radius still has this get method here, but diameter doesn't have that method, and it doesn't have that prop because we got rid of it. But it still is getting set, or it's still gettable. And if I go down here and do wheel dot diameter equals 100, it'll set it. So I can set that, I can get that, which is quite cool. But then let's look at wheel.radius equals 100. Ooh, old habits. And that is settable too. And that wasn't something I wanted to be able to set. I wanted setting that to be private. So one big loss between Imba 1.52 and whatever version of Imba 2 this is that we can't have an instance variable that acts as though it is private. So once again, I made a really big deal when we talked about Imba 1 about how variables were always private, and it was just through methods that classes could communicate with one another and send messages. So here, while behind the scenes, it is still methods that are public, right? Because behind the scenes, I'm still constructing a getter and a setter for the radius and the diameter. But I don't have any insight into that as the programmer, and I don't actually have any way to stop that from happening. So I don't really, like, looking at it, it really acts and looks like those instance variables are public always, which is something that I am not very happy about. I would prefer to have more control over that. I would prefer for them to be, I would prefer for all variables to be private unless I am setting up methods to replace them. Other than that, there's where we set up the circumference factor and the color. You'll notice with the color, especially, it's a really obvious case here. I'm still setting it to red here, but now when I log the color, this, by the way, I should have mentioned this at the start. This has not changed. I am like instantiating exactly the same way, logging exactly the same stuff. But the color here has gone from red in the Imba 1.52 example to undefined. And the reason that's happened is because now this actually is behaving as a local variable within this constructor method. So it is, I think this is like a really big fix, because now it is very clear where I have instance methods, where I have local methods, and they behave exactly the way I would expect them to. Because I never defined color to be a instance method, I don't have that getter and setter, I can't grab it. Just for fun, what if I did? So if I have a color getter and pass it color, it's still not going to work. I get the actual method back. This is neat. I'm getting past this method from this method in a neat kind of recursive thing. I bet if I put some brackets on that, same exact thing. What if I do self? Same thing. Okay, very cool. Sorry about that little detour. Another thing to notice is that when I look at circumference, I had to put this self explicitly on it. I don't know. I believe that when I watched the last meetup, they were saying implicit self is back in, and it is gonna be in. So I should be able to do this. Maybe that version just isn't pushed yet. Maybe I misheard them. But either way, I need to have that self, and I think I even need to have those brackets, because if I don't have those brackets, it's going to return the actual function instead of evaluating it. So I went from in Imba 1.52 having 4 ways to express exactly the same thing to now having to show both the empty brackets, which once again was not the Imba syntactic norm, and I have to have the explicit self. So that seems like a bit of a loss to me, though not as significant as losing that control over the instance variables. So I think that is pretty much everything I want to talk about. I think I noticed that same kind of trouble with the brackets here. Like if I add brackets to circumference down there, it breaks. Like something is going on that is different from Imba 1 and not as intuitive. It was more difficult for me to understand. So if anyone can clarify that behavior for me, that would be really, really helpful. I'd really appreciate that. And yeah, once again, when I set the, sorry, I'm jumping around a lot, but going back to the color variable, here it's undefined. And then when I call paint green, after logging the color once, I get the same thing, undefined, because this is also a local variable. But this is really interesting. I did not have to put var before it. So it thinks that color has been instantiated, the variable, right? Because if I don't have var here, then I get an error. So it thinks that color, like this color must be the same as this color, but it is still scoped properly locally. So that is, I think, is pretty interesting. So I'm sure that there's more interesting differences here in Imba 2, more interesting behaviors. If you notice anything, please let me know, because I really am trying to understand what is different between Imba 1.52 and this version of Imba 2, and what is the significance of those differences, and like understanding the differences and understanding the state of both versions of Imba will really empower us to choose which version of Imba we want to use for our projects. So the next thing I want to look at is the proposals that I saw in the latest meetup. So I think it was March 17th, March 18th of 2020. And so some things that were proposed were having prop be optional or not required, and just putting the property that was going to have the getter and setter, right? So just put the instance variable there, and the prop is implied. And I think that this is harder to read. I think it is bad because when I check out a branch and then think I'm typing in the console, but I'm actually typing in my code and type git, it's just going to compile. Like that is totally fine. Like I could typo anything here and it's just gonna like compile and work. That might be shaky grounds. Maybe you should say, like, it's reasonable for you to say, well, don't do that, just write good code. But I think there are other problems, like by saying that we just imply the prop here, you're saying that like that is the only thing we can do. Like we can prop and that's it, right? But maybe one day we're gonna have other kinds of manipulation that we want to do on our instance variables, like other shorthands that will live in that same spot on top, right under the class definition. For instance, Ruby has the attr accessor, but it also has the attr reader and attr writer. And so saying that we can just imply it kind of forces us into a position where if we want to do more stuff there, it becomes ambiguous, or we imply one thing and then have all the other things explicit, which seems weird and preferential to prop. So that's maybe a more legitimate reason to not like this change. I also just think it's harder to read. Another change is like if I uncomment these lines, they still, or sorry, that's unrelated, that's Imba 2. Another change though that they were floating around was to get rid of the @ symbol, and I could not tell. They didn't explicitly say whether it was being replaced by another symbol or not, but from the examples that I saw in the meetup, it looks like it was just treated like it's just a variable. They're all the same. Instance variables don't need at, just name them. And they had an example very much like these two lines here, where you passed in a local variable and then set the instance variable that had the same name. So in this case, we're passing in radius, and then we're setting the instance variable radius to the variable we passed in, the argument we passed in, radius. And there was talk about whether or not that was confusing or ambiguous. And I think it is definitely confusing. And while maybe not technically ambiguous, like maybe the compiler can handle this correctly every time, it is a recipe for people having mistakes in their code that they can't find. So and like when you look at it in the larger context, like add this line with diameter here, the problem just becomes so much more obvious, because like, what is this referring to now? Is it referring to this, the passed in argument? Is it referring to this instance variable? I mean, it doesn't really matter, but this is very, very clearly ambiguous. And even if you could memorize the behavior, right? Like, oh, after I've defined the local variable or the instance variable, it will always use the instance variable instead of the local variable, or the other way around. Like, you can memorize that behavior, but that's the kind of thing you're always going to find yourself looking up and trying to remember because there's some weird error in your code that you're trying to track down. So that is something I'm really, really not a fan of. But once again, it was just a proposal, hasn't made its way in yet. Another thing that I want to point out that's a consequence of this is it's really hard to look at this and say what my local variables are, what my global variables are. Right? So like if I mean for something to be local or I mean for something to be global, it's kind of hard to tell which ones are which. So that's something that I would want to be aware of. I think those are the two big changes that were proposed. I think implicit self is coming back. So that one is something I'm really, really excited about. Once again, I just watched the meetup video. I think I watched it twice. So there's a good chance I could have misinterpreted something that was said, or I just misunderstood a concept. So if you think I am wrong and I am treating these proposed changes unfairly, please just let me know. I'd be really happy to talk about them more in depth. Like really happy, you have no idea. So the very last thing I want to touch on is just to look at the best case scenario. If Imba worked exactly the way that like made intuitive sense to me, what would it look like in this case? So this is the wheel function once again. This is exactly the same. I've just noted the outputs here. So I really think that explicitly having these props is a good thing. It is very clear that I want a getter and a setter for these two things in particular. So yeah, that's something I would really, really like to see. I think this should not work. I think that was a really, really strong move moving from Imba 1 to Imba 2 is to prevent just defining variables all over your class definition and causing like people to have to figure out what that would mean in terms of when those variables were used throughout the class. There is a difference here in the constructor. It's that I don't think I should have to say let or var or whatever here, because from context, like it should be able to tell that I am defining a new variable here, because I didn't say def, so I'm not defining a method. There is no method and there is no variable. So the choices that we have here are either throw an error because I don't know what that thing is, or assume that it is the only thing it could be, which is me defining some kind of variable. And I would really like if it would just make that assumption for me. That would really, I think, it's like one of the few things that is like extraneous code in Imba that can be torn out are all those vars. So that would make me really, really happy. It would move Imba more in the Rails Python direction that I love so much. The other thing that I would really, really like to see is for, this is a little bit more technical, like maybe I'm thinking maybe I'm asking for something that just can't happen. But what I would really love to see is for code blocks to have their own scopes. So like a method is just a code block. And it runs all this code. And I would really like for there to be a scope that is just this block so that my local variables are local, and variables that are defined on the class that aren't instance variables, I like if I could define a variable here, right? I should not be able to, like, that should not be easily accessible from within my scope. So, or maybe it should be, but I really think that if this was its own scope, I could count on color being only defined in here because I didn't mark it as an instance variable. And I think that would make it really, really clear where my instance variables were, where my local variables were. I think it would make the pain that some people feel with implicit self, I think it would really reduce that, because you'd always look within the method first for your variable, and if it found it, great, it would use that. And if not, then you move on to the outer scope of your class, and that's when you find the method that you're referring to. So calculate circumference, that's when it finds it here, or it finds the variable here if we're still allowing that, which once again, I don't think we should. So that would be something I would really, really like to see. Other than that, I'm very, very happy with the state of Imba so far. I really am looking forward to any comments, questions, or corrections on this video. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your Imba projects.